Ah, welcome back. Okay, so we're going to be talking about borders and boundaries. So if we sort of consider what we are, we're always talking about boundaries and borders and border walls and sort of these ideas of nation states, right? And this is something that in the world is relatively new. Okay, it's relatively new, and it really isn't until the last few hundred years that we really start to understand sort of what we have as our modern ideas of sort of the nation state. Okay, one of the things that we brought up last week, talking about race and nativism versus immigrants. And we talked about how Europeans, as they were coming over in the 19th and 18th century, how, they weren't always considered to be like white, right? They were hailing from different countries. They were coming over for different reasons. But oftentimes they were seen as distinctly different. Okay. So if you were Scandinavian, you might not be considered to be like racially white. You would be Scandinavian, right? You would be Swedish or Norwegian. If you were German, you would be seen as German or French or Irish or whatever. That would be seen as distinct. Okay, so those sort of ideas, those are ethnic ideas, right? Ethnic representations. When we talk about Irish culture, that's an ethnicity. Okay, when we talk about German or Scandinavian or Ethiopian or wherever, right? These are ethnicities. Now, ethnicities can be connected to states, but they don't necessarily have to be connected to states. And so as people were coming over, right, we had this conflict between nativism and immigrants. This is still something that we're dealing with today. If we're looking at who's coming across the southern border, right? This can be a big issue that we are still dealing with about who is American, what are those, what constitutes American, what language do you have to speak? On a national level, there is no law that says that English is the American language that we have to speak, right? There's no law that states that you have to speak English. So, but that sort of becomes an issue, right? To get along in the United States, you probably need to know English. Well, mostly, right? There's plenty of places in this country where you don't actually have to speak English. Certainly within like border states, along the southern border where you have a lot of immigration coming over, you might have entire communities where you could go in and speak Spanish the entire time you're there and do your regular business. And people live that way. There are whole communities in Los Angeles where you could go into that community and never hear anyone speak a word of English. So that can happen. If we talk about the Pennsylvania Dutch, okay, if we talk about the Amish, right, that they're speaking Pennsylvania Dutch. It's not English, right? And they're just as American as anyone else, but they also have this distinct ethnicity, this distinct culture from everyone else. And they speak their own language, right? So we can look at different ethnicities around the country and recognize that, things are different in different parts of the country. And that's okay. That's what makes the United States so freaking cool as far as I'm concerned is that diversity, is having all these different ideas and languages and concepts coming together and being shared in one place. That's not to say that there isn't conflict, right? That there isn't something going on within various communities, and that'll probably never stop. Right? We'll probably never see the end of conflict because of differences. How we deal with those conflicts, right? That can be adapted. We don't have to have violence. We can have discussion, right? And that is ultimately what, as anthropologists, that's kind of what we would like to see happen, especially if you're in the applied field of anthropology, where, you know, part of your goal as an applied anthropologist, as I've worked as an applied anthropologist in the past, is to create those sort of bridges between people and to create solutions to cultural problems. So, yeah, we understand that there are problems. We also understand that ethnicity can be connected to a country, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, right? It doesn't have to be connected to a nationality. It can be pockets within, and it can expand outside. There was an interesting story on NPR within the last week where they were talking about there's a Native American tribe along the southern border that is currently being divided by a border wall, right? Trump's border wall is being put up. And the tribe, which is split into 4 different bands, basically are not only on the United States side, but on the Mexico side as well. And they're connected, right? They're all part of it, but they sort of, you know, they extend past the border. And by building that wall, you are effectively cutting off ties between these two communities, cutting off easy access between these communities. And so, you know, we have sort of our this example right here of where you have a culture that is going beyond borders, right? It's going beyond the Mexico United States border because it's, you know, traditionally been in that location. So that's something that we have to take into account. If we look at, let's say, the Kurds, okay? So the Kurds actually live in 4 different countries, right? Iraq, Syria, Turkey, and Iran. But they don't actually have their own state. They don't have their own nation. Now, the area in which they live in, they call it Kurdistan. But Kurdistan does not actually have an actual state. It's not actually recognized as its own entity. But it is an area in which the Kurds live. And the Kurds live in these different countries. And the Kurds have made the news in the last couple of decades, most recently because of what was going on in Afghanistan and Turkey and Syria. Just heartbreaking sort of betrayal of the Kurds as American allies. The United States had them as military allies, even though they aren't necessarily a nation, right? But they are a culture, and they are organized in such a way. So you have this stateless nation that exists. And there are quite a few of these stateless nations that have an identity, but don't necessarily have the borders or the clout within their government. So if you look at like the Sami, or what oftentimes are called the Laplanders of northern Scandinavia. Well, they're basically sort of like the native Scandinavians that were there before anyone actually migrated to Scandinavia. They've been there for a long time. They're sort of like the Inuit of Canada and United States. They've been there for a long time, but they don't have their own state. They have their own culture, their own identity, right? But they don't have their own state. So if we look at what's happened in the United States, we can certainly look at like Native American groups. When I worked as an archaeologist in Oregon, I worked with the Klamath and the Modoc tribes. And one of the things that's interesting about the Klamath and the Modoc is that they don't have a reservation. They don't have any particular territory that says that this is Klamath or this is Modoc tribal lands. And this is because their lands, which they had at one point, were sold. And done so in a way that the federal government had a program that was designed basically to buy these tribal lands from these tribes. A lot of these, and it was kind of a real, again, insidious federal approach to gaining more land and resources. So the interesting thing about the Klamath and the Modoc, and specifically the Klamath, is that they were very, very successful when it came to resources. So when they were put onto the reservation, essentially they were forced to move on here, but their land was rich in timber. Right? They had a lot of forest, a lot of trees, and they went ahead and started up this industry, this timber industry, and had mills up and were very profitable. And they were, in fact, like the only tribe that was able to sort of, have this self-determination that a lot of tribes either couldn't afford because they didn't have the resources on the reservation, or were generally kind of screwed out of by the federal government. The Klamath, on the other hand, had these resources and used them well. So well that it gathered a lot of attention from the federal government, and they came out and said, oh, listen, we'd really like to buy these lands from you, and we're going to give you a smoking deal, right? We're going to pay every member of the tribe like $54,000 or $43,000 for their share. And this was sort of decided not by the tribe, but by a few individuals who sold the land out from under. And there was also this concept within the Klamath that you really can't own the land. Right? Nobody can own the land, right? I mean, you can't own these trees and you can't own those mountains. And so they're like, go ahead, we'll take your money. That's no problem. We'll take your money. And they did, and that created a whole lot of problems for the community. Most of the money that was sold was spent within a few years of it actually getting into the hands of the tribal members. And so we ended up seeing a lot of poverty right off the bat. The tribal structure started to fall apart. And you run into a lot of issues. Again, now you had a sort of a stateless nation to begin with, right? As in the Klamath and the Modoc, they had an area of influence, an area where they traveled, but there weren't any maps or clear borders that said, well, this is Klamath and Modoc and Yahuskin territory. And then they were forced onto a reservation, and then that reservation was sold / stolen from them. And now you've got a stateless nation again, where you have this culture, right, this ethnicity that exists, but no actual lands to claim as their own, as a separate entity from the United States or from the state of Oregon. So, we find that how some cultures become independent, can come about from very different ways, and how some nationalities can come together in different ways, and we're going to be talking more about that here in a bit. If we look at ethnicity and conflict, so we know that culture can oftentimes be in conflict within itself. We see this in our own constantly, and it changes with the power flow, right? Who's got power, who doesn't? People flock to new leadership, and if it fits a better idea than what was before, and we can certainly see that happening within our own political structure right now. With people that have different ideals coming into power, and then people not liking what they do with that power and then taking it away. So we know there's conflict in culture. Conflict can oftentimes become more and more exaggerated when these different ideas start to change identity, right? What happens when these ideas to your identity are becoming more and more challenged? This can be seen again, sort of like what's going on within Christianity. So if you pay attention to the news and you listen to, especially like conservative news, you will hear oftentimes that there is like an attack on Christianity, that there is an attack on the right to go to church and all of this stuff. And whether or not that's true, and as an anthropologist and paying attention to all of this, if you look at the numbers, we are seeing a change in the demographics within the United States when it comes to religious belief. Part of it is the fact that there are a lot of people that are stepping away from Christianity. There's a lot more atheists and a lot more agnostics out there than there ever used to be. If we go back even 25, 30 years, where the cultural identity of the United States, it was about 90% recognized themselves as Christian. That's changed. We're down to like 70% of Americans see themselves as Christians. So whether or not there's an attack on Christianity or people are leaving Christianity, that's also something that's up for debate. And a good question to ask, and somebody should write a paper on that. So what's going on here? Well, again, people are seeing something taking place, right, within their identity. They're saying, like, I'm Christian, but I feel attacked right now because my Christian rights are being taken away, which is also sort of this big contention with our latest Supreme Court Justice nominee, Amy Coney Barrett. Her thing is that she's a Catholic Christian. She's got some very distinct views on like Roe v. Wade and on on sort of these traditional ideas on LGBTQ. Now, whether or not you follow this or, and we're not really going to get into it, but a lot of people see her as sort of this, as a pushback towards certain Christian values, Christian conservative values. So we're seeing different changes within our culture depending on the perception that different people have in that conflict. Whether or not that conflict is real or whether it is exaggerated by the media, whatever that media is, whether it's conservative, whether it's not, doesn't matter, right? There is this pushback. So, when we examine culture, whether it's our own or somebody else's, we have to sort of look at those conflicts, right? What's being said, what's being done, what is actually happening versus what's being said, right? Again, that theoretical truth and that ground truth. Do we see these different conflicts, and how are they being dealt with? So, as we're going through and looking at culture and looking at these ideas of identity, right? We have to sort of look at how there's conflict involved and how important is that conflict. If we look at sort of what's going on with the Supreme Court justice nominee, we can extrapolate a lot of different things that's going on as a result. We can look at Christianity as being a component, whether or not it is a major component to how she will sort of work as a justice, right? And it's hard, and of course, as an anthropologist, we try and recognize our own biases, right? And the idea is if you're a justice that you sort of leave your bias at the door. That really doesn't work. And that's obvious if you look at, each of the justices on there now and how they normally make their decisions, whether they're conservative or liberal, right? So we know that she's going to be, conservative because she has a very long history of conservative ideas. So, but we can start to kind of look at her through these different lenses. Right, so she's Catholic, and she's woman, right? She's a woman. So how do gender roles fit into this, right? She's replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was instrumental in women's rights and gender equality and all of this stuff. So there's that approach and how politics are going to kind of deal with her as a woman, because you're going to replace a woman with a woman on the Supreme Court. But there's also very different components going on as well. So you've got the religious factor. You have different values that are going to be a part of that conservative approach, right? So if we're talking about values, what kind of values does she have, and what kind of values is she going to be dealing with? So, when we look at sort of the conflict within cultures, when we look at the things that we consider to be important, that's I think it's an interesting time in American history because there is so much conflict going on right now. I mean, this year has just been, I think the term is shit show. Just when it comes to politics and to, and it doesn't matter what politics you believe in, it's been crazy, right? And the environment, on fire, and the apocalypse is coming, and you've got murder hornets, and the pandemic. I mean, talk about conflict. And it's interesting to think about all of these different things and how they're having an impact on the individuals within that community. So, and that's, again, how do we deal with all of these different things? So, they're all interconnected. All of these things are completely and totally interconnected. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind. All right. All right, we're going to pause here for a moment, and then we'll come back in just a few.